Hello. Welcome to another day of Through the Mark with Jed Wilson. Through the Gospel of Mark, we have been talking about our fourth controversy lately, where we have walked through the first three, and we did the first one itself, as there are two stories to it. And so, if you remember the last one, Jesus was doing something on the Sabbath, in which the Pharisees did not like it. He was eating, they were picking grain on the Sabbath and eating it. Well, in Mark 3, the controversy continues, and it's that same kind of, there's four controversies. This is still part of the fourth one, and so we will continue, so we'll read it here. Jesus went into the synagogue again and noticed a man with a deformed hand. Since it was the Sabbath, Jesus' enemies watched him closely. If he healed the man's hand, they planned to accuse him of working on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the deformed hand, "Come and stand in front of everyone." Then he turned to his critics and asked, "Does the law permit good deeds on the Sabbath?" So does the law permit good deeds on the Sabbath, or is it a day for doing evil? Is this a day to save life or to destroy it? But they wouldn't answer Jesus. They wouldn't answer him. He looked around at them angrily and was deeply saddened by their hard hearts. Then he said to the man, "Hold out your hand." So the man held out his hand, and it was restored. At once the Pharisees went away and met with the supporters of Herod to plot how to kill Jesus. Now, if you read this in any other translation, it will talk about Herodians, supporters of Herod. They go out and meet with them. And there's key details. There's key details throughout this story to kind of recognize and to ponder and consider and think about. With that being the Herodians and the Pharisees, if you notice, they get together afterwards and plan to figure out a way to remove Jesus, to kill him. Which is quite shocking here because, well, Herodians and Pharisees, they really don't like each other. They really hate each other. They're actually enemies, and they team up just to take Jesus down. That is how much Jesus is hated. You see, it reminds me of a film. I don't know if you can recognize this. You can actually watch it. I will post the link to this in the description. But if you know Marvel, there's a scene in there between Loki and his brother after his mom dies, which is kind of Loki's fault. And they hate each other, right? Like, one ended up getting his mom killed. They've been brutal enemies this entire time up through the Marvel's kind of MCU universe. They've been kind of enemies. And here they are. If we end up watching the clip, like, Thor shows up and he's like, "We need to get revenge on what they did to Mother," and they end up teaming up. It just reminds me of this scene because you have two people who really don't like each other, who have never teamed up before. They kind of team up just to take down the greater threat. And that's what these two do. They team up to take down the greater threat to Asgard, and they end up just partnering. Um, and so it just reminds me of this. I'm kind of a movie type nerd. So it just reminds me of this film here, which I also thought it has some very similar correlations in that if you know this scene, Loki has like magic where he can make things appear a certain way. And when Thor shows up for his help, he puts on a good face. Right? He looks angry, but you don't see what's actually going on in the jail cell. And he makes it kind of look pretty, but on the inside, he's disfigured. He's being tormented by kind of his mistake. Really dirty on the inside, right? It really does remind me of the Pharisees and the Herodians, that they put on this good face, but on the inside, there is this part of them that is dirty, that is evil, that is wicked, planning to kill an innocent person who's just doing good on the Sabbath. So lots of correlations between kind of this scene, which I will post in the description, and this story here. They kind of remind me of one another. And so after Jesus heals this man, after he heals him and his withered hand is restored, the Pharisees go out and commit a worse sin. Like, they plan to murder someone. With the Herodians, they partner with their enemies. They plan to murder someone just because he healed someone on the Sabbath. So he does good on the Sabbath, and they choose to get rid of him. It's very ironic, right? The whole point of not working on the Sabbath, at least they thought, was to be pure and to do kind of the work of God. They thought to do the work of God was to celebrate the Sabbath properly. And here Jesus does something good that, like, you would think God would be very pleased with, healing a man with a withered hand, which allows him to work and restores him into the community. And instead, they plot to kill him. Very ironic, very kind of controversial. And so the whole story for those reading Mark is that Jesus works on the Sabbath. And so we've had 4 controversies up to this point, and Mark is having us see these controversies because he's trying to get his readers to make a choice on the controversy of Jesus. Which side do you fall on in these controversies? And that becomes even more evident in the next few stories, that he's putting his readers and he wants his audience to make a choice, to decide how they view Jesus. Is he really a rebel who's breaking the law on the Sabbath? Is he really God forgiving sins? That's the questions Mark actually wants you to decide. Do you believe it or do you not? And so this is the 4th controversy. There's a few ways that we can apply this, Jesus being Lord over the Sabbath, being king over the Sabbath. The first thing is, recognize it was controversial in their day, right? Jesus is controversial in so many ways. And so how can we, as Christians, share the truth in love when people find Christian views controversial? How can Christians share those views even when it's controversial? It's easy to say, tell the truth in love, but what does that look like? What does that mean? How do you practically approach that? The church has oftentimes, I have noticed, fallen on one of two sides. They're either they just share truth and don't care about how they do it, and it just then hurts people and drives people away, or the church doesn't share truth and they just try to reach people without sharing truth. They try to go so far loving that they never really address the things that they should address. And so as Christians, we have to find the balance of sharing truth in love. And the question is, how do you do that then when it is controversial? And you really should think through that, because you will run into cases in your life where it'll get very controversial sharing Christian views, especially if you are an outspoken Christian. It can get very controversial. And so you have to think through, how can I share the truth of the gospel? How can I share the truth of Jesus in a way that reaches people and doesn't push people away? That's kind of what we're getting at there. Now, how can you practically live out the Sabbath in your life? Jesus is Lord over the Sabbath, wants you to have Sabbath rest properly, observe the Sabbath in its proper manner. So how can you observe the Sabbath in your life in particular? How can you rest? Who can you serve or help this Sabbath? Jesus helps people on the Sabbath. The Sabbath is not just about, me and resting, but he actually meets the needs of those around him. And so is there someone or something you can do this Sabbath to help reach someone's needs, to help people in the community? Now, if you go to church, plan to help someone this Sunday. Serve in a ministry, help straighten out chairs, clean up the floor. If they take communion, there's usually tends to be some form of a mess somewhere that's got to be cleaned up. So how can you help this Sunday? Do it practically, do it specifically, find a way to help this Sunday. Now, if you don't go to church, find a church you can visit this week. That would be the first step to, I think, celebrating the Sabbath, is to be with God's people on the Sabbath, hearing the message of God on the Sabbath, to grow in relationship with God. And so if you don't have a church, find one. Visit one this week. If you do have a church, serve in it and go above and beyond as you serve faithfully and joyfully. So to recap our controversy stories thus far, our first one, do you remember it? Yes, Jesus forgives sins. Our second one is that Jesus called the tax collectors the sinners. He challenges that social status. The third thing that makes Jesus controversial is the way he fasted and the old covenant not fitting into the new. Well, he doesn't fast. And the old covenant not fitting into the new. And then the one we covered today, Jesus works on the Sabbath. These are things that in Jesus' day made him controversial. And Mark is trying to ask you, which side are you on? Do you believe Jesus is what the Pharisees claim? Or do you think he's doing the right thing in these controversy stories? See you next time.